Hermeticism is one of the most enigmatic and influential intellectual and spiritual currents in Western history. It is a tradition of religious, philosophical, and esoteric thought, based primarily upon writings attributed to a legendary figure, Hermes Trismegistus, or Hermes the Thrice Great. This figure was himself a syncretic fusion, combining the attributes of the Greek god Hermes, messenger, god of commerce, boundaries, and language, with the Egyptian god Thoth, god of wisdom, writing, magic, and the moon. At its core, Hermeticism is a path of Gnosis, or divine knowledge. It posits a universe where, as above so below, meaning the microcosm of the human being is a direct reflection of the macrocosm of the universe, and that to know oneself is to know God, and the All. It emerged as a philosophy in the crucible of Roman Egypt, where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and Persian ideas collided, but it claimed a lineage far more ancient, stretching back to the dawn of Egyptian civilization. This tradition is not monolithic. It split early in its development into two distinct, though often overlapping, branches: the philosophical Hermetica, texts concerned with theology, cosmology, the nature of God, the fall of the soul into matter, and its eventual salvation through Gnosis. The technical Hermetica, texts providing practical instruction on astrology, alchemy, and magic, Theurgy, all designed to apply the principles of the philosophy to manipulate or understand the cosmos. For centuries, Hermeticism was revered as the Prisca Theologia, or ancient theology, a pristine, divine revelation given to humanity in remotest antiquity, of which the systems of Plato, Moses, and Christ were later, and perhaps less pure, echoes. Its journey through history is a dramatic one. From the sands of Egypt to the libraries of Arabic caliphs, from the heart of the Italian Renaissance to the crosshairs of the early scientific revolution, and finally into the subterranean streams of Western esotericism, where it continues to nourish modern occult and spiritual movements. This synopsis will trace that journey. The entire Hermetic tradition rests on the authority of its purported founder, Hermes Trismegistus. This figure is not, in a historical sense, a real person. He is a mythological construct, a powerful syncretism that symbolizes the fusion of two great ancient cultures. The process began when the Greeks, under Alexander the Great, conquered Egypt in 332 BCE. In the subsequent Ptolemaic period, they practiced Interpretatio Graeca, the tendency to identify foreign deities with their own. In the Egyptian god Thoth, they found a perfect match for their own Hermes. Thoth was the Egyptian god of profound wisdom, law, and knowledge. He was the scribe of the gods, the inventor of writing, the measurer of time, and the patron of all sciences. He was a lunar deity, associated with the ordering of the cosmos, magic, and the judgment of the dead. Hermes was the Greek messenger of the gods, the god of thresholds, communication, and interpretation. He was the divine trickster, the guide of souls to the underworld, and the god of eloquence. When these two figures were combined, the result was Hermes Trismegistus. The epithet Trismegistus, or thrice great or thrice greatest, likely stems from an Egyptian epithet for Thoth, great, 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 used to denote his superlative wisdom. This new unified figure was seen by the Greeks and Romans in Egypt as the ultimate source of all knowledge, divine, human, and natural. He was imagined as an ancient Egyptian priest, king, or sage who had lived millennia ago, some even claiming he was a contemporary of Moses. He was credited with writing a vast library of books, tens of thousands of volumes, that contained the sum total of human and divine knowledge, covering philosophy, magic, astrology, medicine, and alchemy. This mythical attribution was critical. By claiming Hermes Trismegistus as the author, the writers of the Hermetic texts were performing a brilliant act of intellectual marketing. They were cloaking their own philosophical and spiritual ideas, which were heavily influenced by contemporary Platonism and Stoicism, in the unassailable authority of ancient sacred Egyptian wisdom. This granted their texts a prestige and perceived antiquity that they would not have otherwise possessed, allowing them to compete with the other great revelations of the era, including Judaism and emerging Christianity. The texts we now call the Corpus Hermeticum were not written by an ancient Egyptian priest. As the 17th century scholar Isaac Casaubon would later prove, they were written in Greek, not Coptic or hierarchical Egyptian, and their philosophical language is deeply embedded in the intellectual world of the 1st to 4th centuries CE. The birthplace of these texts was the multicultural melting pot of Roman Egypt, specifically the great city of Alexandria. This environment was perhaps the most intellectually dynamic and religiously diverse in the entire Roman Empire. It was a crossroads where multiple traditions met, clashed, and combined. Some of these include Greek philosophy. This was the lingua franca of the educated elite. The Hermetic texts are unthinkable without Platonism. Concepts like the transcendent, ineffable one, the divine mind, the creation of the cosmos by a lesser demiurge, and the idea of the soul's imprisonment in matter are all drawn from the Platonic tradition. Stoicism also contributed, particularly the idea of a rational ordered cosmos, logos, and the interconnectedness of all things through a web of sympathy. Egyptian religion. While the philosophy was Greek, the atmosphere and authority were Egyptian. The texts are filled with reverence for Egypt as the only land where the gods walk with men. They express a deep pessimism about the material world and a yearning for liberation that echoes older Egyptian beliefs about death and the afterlife, though reframed as an intellectual Gnostic ascent rather than a purely ritualistic one. The Asclepius, a text that survived in Latin, contains a famous lament for Egypt, prophesying that the true religion will one day be abandoned and Egypt, the image of heaven, will become desolate. Jewish thought. Hellenistic Judaism, particularly the work of the Alexandrian philosopher Philo-Judaeus, 20 BCE, 50 CE, had already pioneered the blending of Greek philosophy with biblical revelation. Philo's use of the Logos as an intermediary between a transcendent God and the material world provided a model for the Hermetic writers' own hierarchies of divine emanations. Gnosticism. Hermeticism is often considered a cousin to Gnosticism, or perhaps a more optimistic and world-affirming branch of the same broad spiritual movement. Both systems share a core belief. Humanity is a divine spark trapped in a hostile material world, and salvation comes not from faith or works, but from Gnosis, a special revealed knowledge of one's true divine origin. The Hermetic texts were likely written by small intellectual circles or clubs within Alexandria, composed of educated pagans searching for a personal, spiritual alternative to the increasingly rigid state cults and the growing exclusive monotheism of Christianity. They were not a single unified church, but a loose movement bound by a shared reverence for Hermes and the pursuit of Gnosis. The body of writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus is vast, but it can be organized into a few key collections. The Corpus Hermeticum. This is the most famous collection, comprising 17 short philosophical treatises, numbered 1 to 18, but treatise 15 is missing. They were compiled in Greek and collected by Byzantine editors in the Middle Ages. The collection as we know it today is largely thanks to its rediscovery in the 15th century. These texts are written as dialogues, typically between a divine teacher and a human student. Bukowski, Poimandres. This is the most famous and influential treatise. The narrator receives a vision of Poimandres, the mind of the absolute power, who reveals the origin of the universe. It describes a transcendent, light-filled God who gives birth to a second mind, the demiurge or craftsman, who in turn creates the 7 planetary spheres. It then describes the fall of a primal man, a divine being who, seeing his own reflection in material nature, falls in love with it and becomes trapped, ensphered in the physical body. Salvation consists of recognizing one's own divine, mental nature and reascending through the spheres after death. Other treatises. The other books expand on these themes. Book 4 describes how God filled a great mixing bowl with mind and sent it to earth, and those who baptize themselves in it gain Gnosis and escape reincarnation. Book 13 is a secretive dialogue between Hermes and his son, Thoth, describing the mystical new birth that occurs when the rational mind is quieted and divine knowledge floods in. The Asclepius. This text was not part of the Greek Corpus Hermeticum, but survived independently in a Latin translation. Because it was one of the only Hermetic philosophical texts available in the West during the Middle Ages, it was enormously influential. It is a dialogue between Hermes, his son Thoth, Asclepius, and Ammon. It covers similar themes of God, the cosmos, and man, but it is unique for containing the Lament for Egypt, a poignant prophecy of the end of the true Egyptian religion and the world's descent into darkness, instructions on Theurgy, It explicitly describes how to animate statues of the gods by performing rituals to draw the spirits of stellar demons or divine forces into them. This explicit description of magic made it both fascinating and dangerous to later Christian readers. The technical Hermetica and the Emerald Tablet. Running parallel to the philosophical texts was a much larger, more practical and arguably older body of technical Hermetica. These were the how-to guides of the Hermetic arts. While the corpus was concerned with why man was divine, the technical texts were concerned with how to use that divinity. They covered astrology, mapping the influences of the planets and stars not just for divination, but to understand the jailers of the soul and the forces that bind the cosmos. Alchemy, the art of spiritual and material transmutation. Magic and Theurgy, the creation of talismans, charms and rituals to draw down specific stellar or divine energies for protection, healing or power. The most famous text associated with this branch is the Emerald Tablet. This is not part of the original Greco-Egyptian corpus. It is a short cryptic text that first appears in Arabic sources, 6th to 8th century, claiming to be a translation of a text found on an emerald tablet in the tomb of Hermes Trismegistus himself. The tablet is the foundational text of all Western alchemy. Its central axiom, that which is below is like that which is above, and that which is above is like that which is below, to perform the miracles of the one thing, became the central motto of Hermeticism itself. It encapsulated the entire philosophy of the macrocosm-microcosm relationship, and provided the theoretical basis for why alchemy and magic could work. The philosophical Hermetica do not present a single, perfectly consistent system. They are a collection of texts from different authors over several centuries. However, a set of powerful, recurring ideas forms the core of Hermetic philosophy. At the apex of the Hermetic cosmos is a single, transcendent and ultimately unknowable God. This God is called the Good, the Father, the Light, or the One. He, or it, is the source of all being, but is himself beyond all being. He is eternal, infinite, and creates not through labour, but through an act of emanation, a spilling over of his own divine essence, like light radiating from the sun. Creation is a series of downward emanations from the One. First, the One thinks, and this thought is divine mind. This is the first God, the archetype of all creation, Poimandres himself. This divine mind then gives birth to a second mind, the Demiurge. This Demiurge is the craftsman of the physical universe. He is not evil, but he is a lesser being than the absolute God. The Demiurge creates the 7 planetary spheres and the physical world, which are ruled by governors, or archons. This material cosmos is seen as a prison for the soul, but also as a beautiful, ordered reflection of the divine mind. The most unique aspect of Hermeticism is its optimistic Gnosticism. Man is not a flawed, sinful creature. Man is a divine being who has forgotten his nature. The Poimandres describes how a primal man, a being of pure light and mind, was created in the image of the One. This man was so beautiful that he was given co-creator status, and he could see the entirety of creation. And looking down through the spheres, he saw his own reflection in the material nature below. He fell in love with this reflection and descended to embrace it. In that moment, he became trapped in matter. He was ensphered, and his divine soul was bound in a physical body, subject to the fate of the 7 planets. This makes the human being a dual entity. We have a mortal physical body and an immortal divine soul mind. We are a microcosm of the entire cosmos, containing both the base matter of the earth and the divine fire of God. If the problem is ignorance, the solution is knowledge. Salvation in Hermeticism is achieved through Gnosis. This is not intellectual book learning. It is a direct, intuitive and mystical realization of one's own divine origin. The goal is to know thyself, to realize that you are not your body, your passions or your thoughts, but a spark of the divine mind. This Gnosis is a gift from God, revealed through the Hermetic teachings. It is an inner awakening or regeneration. Once this Gnosis is achieved, the initiate can begin the process of liberation. This culminates after death in the ascent of the soul back to the One. The soul travels upward through the 7 planetary spheres. At each sphere it sheds, or returns, the vice or passion associated with that planet's influence. Having become naked and pure, the soul passes through the 8th sphere, and enters the realm of pure mind, finally being reabsorbed into the One, achieving true immortality and becoming God. While the philosophers sought to escape the cosmos, the technicians sought to master it. They used the core Hermetic principle of sympatheia, the idea that all parts of the universe are interconnected by a web of hidden correspondences, as the basis for their arts. If, as above so below is true, then by manipulating something below, one can cause a corresponding effect above, and vice versa. In the Hermetic worldview, the 7 planets were not just influences, they were the jailers, or governors, who administered fate to the unawakened human. Each planet gave a vice to the soul as it descended into the body. Astrology was the map of the prison. It allowed the Hermeticist to understand what chains of fate they were born with. But more importantly, by knowing these influences, the adept could learn to transcend them. If you knew Mars was making you angry, you could consciously choose to act against that impulse. Advanced practitioners believed they could outsmart their horoscope, becoming masters of fate rather than its slaves. The Emerald Tablet provided the spiritual and theoretical blueprint for alchemy. For the Hermeticist, alchemy was never just about turning lead into gold. This was called chrysopoeia, or gold-making, and was often seen as a vulgar lower pursuit. True, philosophical alchemy was a spiritual practice. The base matter to be transformed was not just a lump of lead, it was the alchemist's own soul. The lead was the unawakened, fallen human, mired in ignorance and passion. The gold was the regenerated human, the enlightened adept who had achieved Gnosis. The famous 3-stage alchemical process was a metaphor for this inner transformation. Negredo, blackening. The death of the old self, confronting one's own darkness and mortality. Albedo, whitening. The purification of the soul, washing away the impurities of passion and ignorance. Rubedo, reddening. The final unification, the rebirth of the new divine self, the fusion of body and spirit, the achievement of the philosopher's stone. Of course, many believed this inner, spiritual process had to be mirrored by an outer, physical one. They believed that by perfecting matter in a laboratory, they were simultaneously perfecting their own souls, as above, so below. If alchemy is mastering the substance of the cosmos, Theurgy is mastering its energies. Theurgy is high-level, ritual magic. It is distinct from Goetia, which involves commanding base spirits for selfish ends. Theurgy was a divine science used to purify the soul and draw down specific beneficial divine or stellar influences. The Asclepius provided the key justification. If all things are connected by sympathy, then the adept can create antennas to attract specific energies. This was the basis for talismanic magic. A theurgist would consult an astrological chart to find the most auspicious moment. At that exact moment, they would forge a talisman from the correct materials, inscribed with the correct symbols, while reciting the correct incantations. The resulting talisman was not just a good luck charm, it was a battery that had successfully trapped and stored the sympathetic energy of Venus, which could then be used for healing, love, or artistic inspiration. The most extreme form described in the Asclepius was the animation of statues, creating a conduit on Earth for a divine force to inhabit, a practice that horrified and fascinated later Christian theologians. After the 4th century CE, Hermeticism faced a dual challenge. First, the intellectual landscape of the late Roman Empire was becoming Platonized by figures like Plotinus and Porphyry, who absorbed some Hermetic ideas but generally looked down on its Egyptian and magical elements. Second, the edicts of Theodosius in the 390s, which made Christianity the state religion and outlawed pagan practices, effectively shut down the public pagan temples and philosophical schools where Hermeticism had thrived. The tradition did not die, but went into 2 different forms of hibernation. The philosophical Hermetica were largely lost to the Arabic-speaking world. However, the technical Hermetica flourished. When the Arabs conquered Egypt and Syria in the 7th century, they encountered a vibrant Hellenistic tradition in cities like Harran. The Harranians, a pagan sect who revered Hermes, were instrumental in transmitting these texts. Arabic scholars, hungry for ancient wisdom, embraced these sciences. Hermes Trismegistus was adopted into their chain of wisdom as Idris, a pre-deluge prophet mentioned in the Quran, blending him with the biblical Enoch. This gave the technical arts a veneer of prophetic respectability. It was in this context that the Emerald Tablet first appeared. translated into Arabic. Figures like the legendary alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan and the philosopher Al-Kindi wrote extensively on alchemy and astrology, citing Hermes as their ultimate authority. This Arabic technical Hermeticism, focused on alchemy and astrology, was then transmitted to medieval Europe through Spain and Sicily in the 12th century, igniting the European alchemical tradition. In Western Europe, the Greek Corpus Hermeticum was completely unknown. However, one key philosophical text survived, the Latin Asclepius. Because it was translated into Latin, it was accessible to medieval scholars. Its reception was ambivalent. Church fathers like Lactantius, circa 250 to 325, had quoted Hermes approvingly, seeing his monotheistic-sounding passages as a pagan prophecy of Christ. However, St. Augustine, 354 to 430, fiercely condemned Hermes in his City of God. He was specifically horrified by the Asclepius's Lament for Egypt and its explicit description of animating statues, which he denounced as demonic. Augustine's condemnation largely won out. For most of the Middle Ages, the Asclepius was known, but it was suspect knowledge. The great medieval philosopher Albertus Magnus, 1200 to 1280, wrote a commentary on it, but he was careful to treat it as a curious pagan artifact. Thus, while technical alchemy and astrology were practiced, the philosophical side of Hermeticism lay dormant, waiting for a key event. The single most important event in the history of Hermeticism occurred in Florence around 1460. A monk working for Cosimo de' Medici, the powerful ruler of Florence, brought back a Greek manuscript from Macedonia. This manuscript contained 14 of the 15 treatises of the Corpus Hermeticum. At the time, Cosimo's prize scholar, Marsilio Ficino, 1433 to 1499, was head of the new Platonic Academy in Florence and was preparing to undertake the monumental task of translating the complete dialogues of Plato from Greek into Latin for the first time. When the Hermetic manuscript arrived, Cosimo gave Ficino a direct and urgent order. Stop translating Plato. Translate this first. Why? Because Cosimo and Ficino believed they were holding the Prisca Theologia, the ancient theology. They believed that Hermes Trismegistus was a real ancient Egyptian sage who lived before Moses, Pythagoras, and Plato. They thought that in their hands they held the original pristine fount of all human wisdom, a Gentile revelation that prefigured and confirmed Christianity. Ficino completed the translation in 1463, and it was published in 1471 under the title Poimandres. The impact was immediate and profound. It was a theological and philosophical bombshell. It gave Renaissance thinkers a non-Christian, yet divinely revealed source of profound spiritual wisdom. It seemed to confirm their own burgeoning Neoplatonism, the idea that the universe is a single, interconnected divine hierarchy, and that the human soul is divine. It provided a philosophical justification for the dignity of man. If man was created in God's image and had a divine mind, then man was not a miserable sinner, but a terrestrial god, a co-creator, a magus who stood at the centre of the cosmos and could command it. It also provided the philosophical software for the technical arts. Ficino himself, a priest, was deeply interested in Theurgy. He wrote a book, De Vita Coelesti, which was essentially a manual of Hermetic talismanic magic, advising scholars on how to use music, planetary colours, and talismans to draw down positive stellar influences to combat melancholy. Ficino's translation of the Corpus Hermeticum became one of the most influential texts of the 15th and 16th centuries. It placed Hermeticism and the magical worldview it championed squarely at the centre of Renaissance intellectual life. Following Ficino's translation, Hermetic philosophy exploded across Europe, fusing with other esoteric traditions like Jewish Kabbalah and informing the work of the era's most brilliant and controversial minds. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, a friend and student of Ficino, was the ultimate Renaissance syncretist. He believed that all philosophies and religions held a piece of the same divine truth. In 1486, he proposed to publicly defend 900 theses drawn from all known sources, Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew, to prove this underlying unity of truth. The preface to this planned debate was his famous oration on the dignity of man. This text is the quintessential expression of the Hermetic Renaissance worldview. In it, Pico has God speak to Adam, not to command him, but to empower him. God tells Adam that, Unlike all other creatures who have a fixed nature, Adam has no fixed form. He is free to sculpt himself, to degenerate into the lower forms of life, which are brutish, or to be reborn into the higher forms, which are divine. This radical freedom and human potential, the power to become God, is a direct echo of the Corpus Hermeticum's high anthropology. Pico was also the first Christian scholar to deeply integrate Jewish Kabbalah with Christian and Hermetic thought. He believed Kabbalah was the key to understanding both Plato and Hermes, creating a Christian Kabbalah that would become a central pillar of Western magic. If Pico was the philosopher, Giordano Bruno was the radical magus. A Dominican friar who fled his monastery, Bruno was a fiery, brilliant and uncompromising evangelist for the Hermetic worldview. He read the Corpus Hermeticum literally. He believed that the true religion was the magical Egyptian religion of Hermes, and that Christianity was a lesser and corrupt form that had led the world into darkness. He was an optimistic magician. He believed that by using Theurgy, man could reverse the fall and regain his divine powers. He was also one of the first proponents of an infinite heliocentric universe. But his reasoning was not scientific, like Galileo's. It was theological and hermetic. He argued God is infinite. An infinite, all-good God must create an infinite creation. Therefore the universe is infinite, with infinite worlds and infinite suns. He believed the Copernican model was correct because it restored the sun, the visible emblem of God, to its rightful place at the centre. His radical, magical and cosmological views led him to be arrested by the Inquisition. He was tried, refused to recant, and was burned at the stake in Rome in 1600. He became a martyr for Hermeticism. In England, Queen Elizabeth I's court conjurer, John Dee, embodied the Hermetic ideal. He was a brilliant mathematician, a geographer, an astrologer, and a practicing magus. He assembled the largest library in England, filled with Hermetic, alchemical, and Kabbalistic texts. He believed in the Prisca Theologia and saw his work as a divine science, using mathematics and magic to understand God's creation. His Enochian magic, a complex system of angelic scrying or communication, was a practical attempt to speak with the original divine sources of knowledge in the same way he imagined Hermes Trismegistus had. This period, 1470 to 1600, was the high water mark, where a magical Hermetic worldview based on as above so below sympatheia and the divine potential of man was a perfectly respectable, even cutting-edge intellectual position. The magic bubble of the Renaissance burst quite suddenly in 1614. The intellectual world was rocked by a philological bombshell dropped by Isaac Casaubon, 1559 to 1614, a brilliant Swiss classical scholar. Casaubon was not a skeptic or a scientist. He was a devout Protestant scholar who was asked by King James I of England to refute the claims of a Catholic cardinal who was using the antiquity of the Church to bolster his arguments. To do this, Casaubon became an expert in dating ancient texts by analysing their language. As a side project, he was asked to look at the revered Corpus Hermeticum. The Hermetic camp expected him to confirm its ancient Egyptian origins, proving it was older than Moses and Plato. Casaubon did the opposite. He read the Greek text with a philologist's eye and announced, with irrefutable evidence, that the Corpus Hermeticum was not written in remote antiquity by an Egyptian priest. His evidence was purely linguistic. No Egyptian traces. The text contained zero trace of authentic Egyptian language, ideas, or names beyond Hermes and Thoth. Pure Greek philosophy. The text's technical philosophical vocabulary, words like nous, logos, gnosis, demiurge, was not the language of ancient Egypt. It was the specific technical language of the Greek philosophical schools of the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. The authors were clearly and demonstrably borrowing from and arguing with Platonism, Stoicism, and Gnosticism, anachronisms. The texts showed an awareness of, and sometimes directly quoted from, texts that were written after the supposed ancient date of Hermes. Casaubon's conclusion was devastating. The Corpus Hermeticum was a product of the Roman imperial period. Its authors were pious forgers, Christians or Gnostic-leaning pagans, who had falsely attributed their own writings to the mythical Hermes Trismegistus to give them a fraudulent air of authority. The effect was catastrophic for Hermeticism's public prestige. The entire Prisca Theologia narrative, which rested on Hermes's antiquity, was shattered. Hermeticism was no longer ancient theology, it was now a late antique forgery. This event marks a major turning point in Western thought. The Hermetic magical worldview, which had been a respectable part of philosophy, was now relegated to the fringes. This disenchantment helped clear the intellectual ground for the new, mechanistic philosophy of figures like René Descartes and the empirical, material science of Francis Bacon. Hermeticism was not disproven as a spiritual system, but its historical claim, the very source of its power, was. It was demoted from revered ancient wisdom to superstitious late antique occultism. Casaubon's dating was a kill shot to Hermeticism as a mainstream intellectual force, but it did not kill the tradition. Instead, Hermeticism went underground, becoming a subterranean stream that fed new, alternative spiritual movements. Its influence became more discreet, hidden within groups that were not part of the mainstream academic or theological establishment. In the same decade as Casaubon's revelation, a new, mysterious brotherhood announced itself to Europe through a series of anonymous manifestos, starting with the Fama Fraternitatis, 1614. This Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross claimed to be a secret order of initiates founded by a Christian Rosenkreutz who had travelled the East and brought back a secret wisdom. This wisdom was a direct and potent blend of Hermeticism, Paracelsian alchemy, and Protestant mysticism. They advocated for a reformation of all art and science, a rejection of barren Aristotelian logic, and a return to the Book of Nature and the divine sciences of alchemy and magic. While the Brotherhood itself may have been a fiction, the Rosicrucian current became a major new vehicle for Hermetic and alchemical ideas, attracting figures like Robert Fludd in England and Michael Meyer in Germany. It was Hermeticism repackaged for a post-Casaubon world, less reliant on a false history and more focused on a secret alchemical spiritual project. Hermeticism also found a welcome home in the developing lodges of Freemasonry. As operative guilds began to accept speculative members in the 17th and 18th centuries, they needed a philosophical and symbolic language. Hermeticism, with its as above so below geometry, its focus on the great architect of the universe, its alchemical symbolism of transformation, and its use of hidden knowledge, was a perfect fit. Elias Ashmole, one of the first speculative Masons, initiated in 1646, was also a famous alchemist and astrologer. Through figures like Ashmole, Hermetic and Rosicrucian ideas were woven into the symbolic DNA of Masonic ritual, where they were preserved and transmitted in coded form through the Enlightenment and into the modern era. While scientific chemistry was breaking away from alchemy, a speculative or spiritual alchemical tradition continued, fueled by Hermeticism. Figures like Thomas Vaughan, 1621 to 1666, and to an extent even Sir Isaac Newton, 1643 to 1727, were privately obsessed with it. Newton, in fact, wrote more on alchemy and theology than he ever did on physics or mathematics, seeing his scientific work as part of a larger project to rediscover the divine, Hermetic wisdom of the ancients. After lying relatively dormant during the rationalist Enlightenment, Hermeticism burst back onto the European stage in the mid-19th century. This was the era of the occult revival, a romantic and spiritualist backlash against the perceived sterile materialism of the industrial age. The key figure in this revival was the French ex-abbé Alphonse Louis Constant, who wrote under the pseudonym Eliphas Lévy. Lévy rediscovered the forgotten traditions of Hermeticism, Kabbalah and magic, but he rebooted them for a modern audience. In his major works, Lévy synthesized everything. He famously correlated the 22 major arcana of the tarot with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, arguing they were both in fact a book of Hermetic wisdom. He posited a single, universal secret doctrine that lay at the heart of all religions and all magic. He popularized the Tetragrammaton and the Baphomet as central magical emblems. Lévy essentially created the grammar of modern occultism, and its core language was Hermetic. Lévy's ideas were picked up in England and formalized into a practical curriculum by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. Founded by 3 Freemasons, William Wynne Westcott, Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, and William Robert Woodman, the Golden Dawn was arguably the most influential magical society of the last 500 years. It was a magical school with a graded system of initiation, modelled on a Masonic lodge and the Rosicrucian grades. Its curriculum was a massive comprehensive synthesis of all Western esotericism, Hermetic philosophy, Kabbalah, alchemy, astrology, tarot, scrying, and practical theurgic ritual. The Golden Dawn took the idea of Hermeticism, as above, so below, the microcosm, macrocosm, the divine human, and turned it into a complex practical system of self-development. Its members included a who's who of early modernism and occultism, including the poet W.B. Yeats, the actress Florence Farr, and its most notorious member, Aleister Crowley. Crowley, a brilliant and rebellious member, would eventually break from the Golden Dawn to found his own religion of Thelema. But Thelema is, at its heart, a radical individualistic expression of Hermeticism. Its central law, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, is a 20th century update of the Hermetic Renaissance idea of the divine, self-sculpting magus, who is the sole arbiter of his own reality. Casaubon's 1614 dating of the Corpus Hermeticum as a 2nd to 3rd century text was, and still is, academically correct. However, the 20th century saw a major re-evaluation of Hermeticism's importance, led by the historian Dame Frances Yates. In her 1964 book Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, Frances Yates proposed a revolutionary new idea, the Yates thesis. She agreed with Casaubon that the texts were not ancient Egyptian, but, she argued, it doesn't matter. What mattered was that the Renaissance thought they were ancient, and this mistaken belief, she argued, was the missing ingredient that sparked the scientific revolution. Her thesis, the Hermetic magical worldview, with its emphasis on man as a divine magus who could operate and manipulate the universe, broke the medieval, passive mindset of contemplation. It gave Renaissance thinkers the psychological confidence to believe that man could understand and control nature. In her view, the magus was the direct ancestor of the scientist. The Yates thesis has been heavily debated and modified by later scholars, but it single-handedly legitimized the academic study of Hermeticism and Western esotericism. Scholars like Wouter Hanegraaff, Antoine Fevre, and Brian Copenhaver now study these texts seriously, not as forgeries, but as a vital third pillar of Western thought, alongside Greek philosophy and Abrahamic religion. Alongside its academic study, Hermeticism continues as a living spiritual path. The New Age movement is deeply, if often unconsciously, infused with Hermetic ideas, the law of attraction, the divine self, the power of crystals and talismans, and the Aquarian Age. Modern occultism, groups tracing their lineage to the Golden Dawn, as well as modern traditions like Thelema, continue to practice Hermetic ritual magic and Kabbalah. Traditionalism. This 20th century school of thought is a more conservative, intellectual expression of the Prisca Theologia idea, arguing that all true religions are expressions of a single, perennial philosophy or tradition. The story of Hermeticism is the story of a useful myth. It began as a syncretic spiritual movement in Roman Egypt, cloaking its 2nd century Gnostic Platonic philosophy in the authority of an imaginary ancient sage. This pious forgery provided the vehicle for a set of powerful ideas: the divine spark within humanity, the interconnectedness of the cosmos, and the path to salvation through Gnosis. Lost to the West, its technical hardware was preserved in the Arabic world, while its philosophical core lay dormant, known only through the suspect Asclepius. It was reborn in the Renaissance, where its history as the Prisca Theologia made it the central philosophy for a new, optimistic vision of humanity. It provided the intellectual and spiritual justification for the magus, the ancestor, Frances Yates argued, of the modern scientist. This dream was broken by the linguistic science of Isaac Casaubon, who proved the texts were late and forged. This event disenchanted the mainstream intellectual world, banishing Hermeticism from the university and the laboratory to the subterranean world of secret societies, Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry, and the occult fringe. It re-emerged in the 19th century, synthesized by Eliphas Levi and weaponized by the Golden Dawn, becoming the operating system for all modern Western magic. Today, Hermeticism lives a dual life. In academia, it is studied as a crucial, complex, and destabilizing third current of Western thought. And in the world of modern spirituality, its core tenets, as above, so below, and know thyself, continue to offer an empowering and enchanted alternative to a purely materialist worldview, proving that the words of the thrice greatest still hold a profound power, even 2,000 years after they were written.